10 stories that are very much the same and at the same time very different this week. So to help us sort out what we have read so far, I've made this stack of cards that you can look at in a sway about each of our authors. This is William Faulkner, and I included in the text that goes with each photograph of the author the birth, death, state of the South in which each author resided, the story we read, how I would categorize it in terms of whether it's a modernist story or a realist story or a protest story, and I'll explain briefly what those are. Modernism tends to have narrative breaks and disruptions. It can be more surreal and you can be unsure of what's happening. I think at the moment when Hawkshaw, the barber, jumps from McClendon's car, we are not sure whether he is trying to save himself or whether he wants Maze to jump out as well, but becomes a little bit more of a stream of consciousness into the bare survival of just Hawkshaw. The story of Minnie Cooper also just looks through a very small lens at her past and at her hysterical breakdown, laughing and screeching behavior. And all of those odd human behaviors without much explanation are characteristics of the narrative breaks and disruptions that can happen in modernist stories. I listed for each of these what we might say is the conflict in the story. There's a series of conflicts, not just one, and there's probably an overall thematic larger conflict, but please keep in mind that most of these categories are theoretical. Maybe you would want to say that Faulkner isn't a modernist, and maybe you would want to describe the conflicts in the stories differently, but this is just a general organizer to think about. Here we have Erskine Caldwell with his cigarette, kind of a contemporary of Faulkner from Georgia. In his story, we have who I would call the protagonist, Clem Henry, and the antagonist, Arch Gunnard, but the story comes from the perspective of Lonnie, a third character who doesn't necessarily have a lot of character. He's just kind of swayed by the people around him and at the end gets sucked into groupthink, which is a very haunting and strange psychological experience. Modernism often has these psychological states that are very disturbing. Ernest Gaines, and I will refer to Gaines and to Richard Wright as protest writers. I think it's most obvious in Gaines's story, The Sky is Gray, that James, the little boy, and Octavia, his mother, have been victimized in a way by the U.S. government. And there's a discussion early in the story by the guitar playing neighbor that the government just left them hanging when they drafted James's father. And I would assume that the father has been drafted into World War II, but the time frame is a little bit ambiguous in early and mid 20th century stories from time to time. The next author is Richard Wright, also the author of Native Son. Big Boy's story is deeply psychologically chilling, and it kind of places you in the shoes of Big Boy and saying, no, don't do that. You can feel the horrors of the choices that he has to make. And I'm calling this protest as well because it's hard to imagine why Bertha and her fiance Jim react to some little boys swimming in a pond in the extreme way that they do. Now, our flashback far into the past here is Kate Chopin, also the author of The Awakening, and her story that is the earliest published story here, and she also died by the time that most of these authors were born. But La Belle Zarade is about a servant, as you know, and this story is incredibly haunting in a similar but very different way that Big Boy Leaves Home is haunting because of the extreme control over the bodies and the sexual identity of the characters. What happens to Zarade and the mechanisms of control that they employ are like are like The Handmaid's Tale, if you're familiar with that more modern story. So I'm calling Chopin realist, but also Gothic. Here we have Eudora Welty. 100 years later than Chopin, she has a woman, a widow, who's actually young, who is so confounded by nature and life and death and chance that she tries to control nature in her garden, perhaps, and has thoughts of murdering a young man so that she could at least momentarily have some control over life and death. Paul Laurence Dunbar's wife, Alice Dunbar Nelson, who I just skipped over, I apologize. The story St. John's Eve is, although it was published in 1900, or wasn't published in 1900, was supposed to be, never was, is a lot more like the other stories from Faulkner and Caldwell because of the psychological absurdity and fear than the protest stories that are more clearly human and a little bit more realistic. Here is Zora Neale Hurston, and Drenched in Light is a joyful story, I think. Whether you consider the grandmother an actual antagonist, I kind of question. I kind of feel like the grandmother and like my children are ISIS most of the time. But those perspectives and points of view and the humor and laughter that we get from looking at childhood versus adulthood and freedom and joy versus order and respect are just something that Hurston does that makes her different from anyone else. Here we have Alice Walker, the youngest of all of our writers, still alive, and she's the author of the story about the sister who goes away and becomes very modern and bougie and highly intellectual and comes back to her family home and tries to take the quilts, the wooden implements, all the things of her family's heritage to use as decorations somewhere else. And the mother and the sister are kind of disdainful of her. And it's ironic because Dee has an African name and is all about her black pride, as this story was written in the Black Arts Movement. Black pride, black power, black is beautiful, but Dee looks down, or Wangaro looks down on everything that's really part of her history of heritage, only looking at it as a decoration. And now Flannery O'Connor died at the age of 39. Walker's story might be a little bit of a parody of Dee or Wangaro. O'Connor's story is definitely a parody of the hypocrisy that we see from Mrs. Turpin, and a lot of absurd things happen, absurd behavior that's pretty comical, so that puts her more in the category with Hurston, although she was born after Hurston published that story in the 1920s. And back to Faulkner. So I hope that helps you see some of the styles and movements and time periods that constitute Southern literature that we've been jumping into with our crash course this week.